Hi, ladies and gentlemen, friends from APO member countries and around the world. Greetings from the Asian Productivity Organization Secretariat in Tokyo. The APO is the leading intergovernmental organization promoting productivity, fostering innovation, and improving competitiveness among its 21 member countries in the Asia Pacific, with our headquarters here in Tokyo, Japan. We are here today for another very exciting APO productivity talk. This time with a special topic that's highly relevant to governments and business leaders as we gear up economic activities and improve productivity even as countries slowly open and lift travel restrictions. So today we are honored to have with us the leading innovation gurus and strategic communication experts, Hsiang and Jon Littman. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Jonathan.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Good evening. Yeah, it's the afternoon now here in Tokyo, but I believe it's about 10 p.m. in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, right,
Yeah.
Chris? Right, Jonathan?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, just by way of introduction, Chris is the leading innovation expert as well as an intellectual property rights lawyer. And she's the CEO of Panorama Growth, which organizes very carefully curated immersion programs and study visits for governments, businesses, and universities to Silicon Valley, as well as other cities in Asia. So Chris is actually a distinguished corporate lawyer and innovation expert, and she bridges the innovation culture of Asia and Silicon Valley. Nice to have you, Chris.
Thank you.
I hope everything is fine in California right now, because I know that, bars and indoor restaurants, as well as movie theaters, have just been closed again this Monday by the California governor. Yeah. So next we have Jonathan Littman. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah. Jonathan is an acclaimed author of 9 international best-selling novels. He's a speaker, a workshop leader, as well as a professor of innovation and disruption. So Jonathan, interestingly, is also the winner of the New York Press Club Award, as well as the Peter Lidzagor Award for exemplary journalism. So great to have you with us, John. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts on effective digital communications.
Thank you, Josh. It's great to be on.
Thank you. So, dear viewers, countries are slowly getting back to normal, or what is at best a new normal. So leaders need to manage more tools and channels of communication than ever before. Hsiang and Jon Littman, leading strategic communication experts, will now share with us what we need to do in order to engage our employees and engage our citizens. So this is about deploying effective storytelling and communication strategies to smartly open up economies and increase productivity. So right now, we need to tell a story for a different war. It's about fighting crisis in postmodern world. So Chris and Jonathan are going to share with us some case studies to explore the correlation between effective communications and trust building during crisis. And I'm very grateful that they are going to share also some frameworks for assessing communication scenarios and techniques to manage uncertainty and empower teams to achieve the desired results. Without further ado, now the floor is open to both of you, Jonathan and Chris. Thank you for the presentations coming up.
Thanks so much. All right, so diving right into our first slide. I think we all know that this is a critical time for leaders. So leaders during this time especially are under a magnifying glass. Whether they communicate negatively or positively can have great impacts on their organizations and on their people. So we know that communications have been more digital. Everything is more digital with COVID-19. And at the same time, information, news is more chaotic. People are dealing with pandemic information overload. So during this time, as a leader, people are looking to you to tell them a vision about the future, to give them direction so that they can move forward. So we are going to cover some case studies today and also some communication techniques that you can apply immediately. We're also going to talk about how do you plan for tomorrow and increase productivity with how you communicate. Next, I'll have John, tell us a little bit about leaders in crisis.
Thanks, Chris. So we all know this man. This is Winston Churchill. A lot of leaders would like to be him right now. In fact, one in Ireland essentially quoted him the other day and did better. I happened to write a small book about Churchill, and he was great at inspiring. He was prolific. And one of the things I tell storytellers is if you want to be a good storyteller, you have to do a lot of it. He wrote 50 books. He won a Nobel Prize for literature. And he started as a young man just writing articles and becoming a speaker. And he worked in these different modes. He mastered the technology of the day. Chris is going to talk a lot about that technology as we go on. So he knew how to do dictation at a very high level for books, speeches, memos. He also showed the importance of speaking directly to people, which is so essential for leaders today. During 5 weeks, just at the dawn of the World War II, he gave 3 critical speeches in the House of Commons. The most famous might be, "We shall fight on the beaches." And he set this sort of high bar for bravery and self-sacrifice, and the nation rose up. Just as I may say, many nations in Asia have risen up in these last months during this crisis. So he led with courage and confidence, and he's a great model for today's leaders. And now I'd like Chris to go on. She's going to talk about why storytelling is still such an important skill today. Next slide.
Especially during a crisis, there is the emotional aspects that leaders have to help people deal with. Social isolation has been causing a loss of productivity among many businesses and large organizations because people feel disconnected to the goal of the organization. People fear potentially losing their jobs, someone getting sick at home. So storytelling is a way for leaders not just to give order, but lead through examples and connect to people, whether in their business, in organization, their people as government leaders on a human level. Also, it moves the focus, great communication examples during this time. Next.
Thanks, Chris. So we've got 5 case studies to jump through, and you see the title here is Leaders Get in Front with Stories. This is sprinters. We got to be fast. And here's a secret. If you do this, you demonstrate leadership, you convey courage and confidence, and you get sort of this 10x response. But you need to be bold. Let's jump to the next one, please. Here we see Sequoia Capital. This is a very famous venture capital firm on the famous Sand Hill Road. So in early March of this year, they came out with this story that coronavirus was going to be the black swan. They did this before any other VC firm, and they got a huge amount of press for this. And their investors were very happy about this because it turned out that later in March and in April was the best time to invest probably in the last 30 years. So you have to be fast. You have to get in front of things. Let's jump on to the next slide if we could. Here we have McKinsey, world famous consulting company. They did something quite similar that we saw with Sequoia. Here we're in May, and they're talking about essentially reopening companies, reopening countries, as many of you are. And they came out with 8 actions that CEOs can take to ensure a safe and successful relaunch. Well, this was partially designed for CEOs, but I think it's ideal also for countries. And some of my favorites here are, having a detailed relaunch map, having sort of a design around that. Also, sort of rebooting operations and supply chain, steering the restart with care. So they was quite thoughtful in how they looked at this, and they also got a lot of attention. Next, please. Well, you have to be fast. We've talked about this. This word iterative. This is a word we talk about a lot. Chris and I in this Silicon Valley, San Francisco vein prototyping. You've got to get things out before you think you can get them out. And here, Twitter, quite a famous firm, in early May announced that anyone could work forever from home. Okay. The interesting thing, they had not figured out how to actually do this shit. They didn't have all the details, but of course they got an amazing amount of attention for coming out with this early strategy. Next,
we want to look at Airbnb's experience during COVID-19. So we know that the travel and hospitality industry has been hit very hard. But with Airbnb CEO, he outright and came out and said, we lost almost everything in 6 weeks that it took us 12 years to build. Now that takes a lot of courage to say, and also, Airbnb was preparing for IPO. So there was a lot on stake, but by being transparent, he's able to gain the trust of his organization and also, created a lot of positive publicity. But it's not just transparency. It's really transparency coupled with action. So immediately, Airbnb doubled down on their experiences section, where they're offering, everything from taking photographs on your iPhone with someone who's been on the National Geographic, cooking with Michelin chefs. So to reiterate a point that John's mentioned, coming out in front is very important when you're communicating and during a crisis. And also coming out with a framework, giving people a sense of direction. And then as you go along, you bring everybody along to help you solve the problem of how do you get to that destination. Next.
Thanks, Chris. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the execution of this. I happen to work with my partner with a very large French UX design company, and they wanted to do something quite similar to what we saw with McKinsey, for instance. They wanted to have thought leadership, and it was critical to do this in a number of different mediums online. We have different ones that we use here in San Francisco that many of you use in your country, and Chris is going to go into that. Here it was, LinkedIn and Twitter and some of these modes here, and not so much Facebook. But we came up with this concept of these sort of 7 habits of the digital revolution. And I want to actually read you a couple of them from the article, because they're really consistent with what I think is important for countries as well. And one of the habits was that technology becomes the engine of work, collaboration, and creativity. And also that businesses and stores become digital first. I think this is really critical today. And that companies learn to excel at prototyping and innovating digitally. And my favorite, which applies for tonight, is that habit number 4, storytelling's central role rises with the digital revolution. Now, why is that? Because you don't have as many physical touch points. So you have to get that story out in a digital way. So I think when we look at this, this is something that you can do yourself in your country. And I think it's so important, and it gives you scale, when you do this. And again, I return to this a couple times tonight, is you've got to have professionals. You've got to be fast and get into channels, and Chris will talk more about that. Let's go to the next.
Yes, and I think one of the things that we've been doing a lot, even during this time, is training, and some of it might be virtual and video-based for leaders, because they want to know, how do I digitally get across my message, whether it's to my organization internally or to a larger public. And we really try to help them hone in, who is your audience? And your audience might not be might consist of many subcultures, many sub-communities. And in our modern world, with so many digital platforms, our audience is often distributed. So depending on who you're trying to reach, and if you're trying to reach a larger audience, you really want to be working with professionals who can help him tap into different channels, different platforms. Often the format, you need to consider the format. So, typical public statement and announcement doesn't fit a lot of the platforms that we see, such as TikTok, Instagram, which maybe focus on the visual element or on the video, action. So those are really important. Scheduling, so frequency really matters in the digital communication world. Shareability. So a lot of times, we expect people, if they want to find the information, they should come to us. They should Google search it. They should come to our website. But that's not the case anymore today. We know just whether some of us who have kids at home, they can't help themselves, right? They're on the social media and they're getting the main source of information there. They're not necessarily saying, hey, what's the website I need to go to give me the real piece of news? How do I go to the source? So as leaders, I think it's really important to think about how then do I change the format of what I'm trying to communicate, because part of increasing productivity is coordination. And if you're not communicating the same things, people are not getting the same information, it's very difficult for them to coordinate and move in one direction. Next is centralization. As we work between different governmental organizations, sometimes the information can become very distributed. Some of it is on the labor organization, some is in Ministry of Information, some is in Ministry of Commerce. That can be very difficult for people, especially during this time. So centralization of information, cross-linking, those are some very fundamental techniques that we work with, organizations and on, especially during this time. And next is just a quick visual I want to show is just in terms of age group. This is one research report that shows how different age group are distributed amongst, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitter. I mean, these are only a few, right, of the many social media communication channels that we see in Asia, so and worldwide. And then John mentioned LinkedIn. That's a very important platform for Western business professional. In some regions in Asia, it's not as prevalent, but when you want to do that kind of cross communication, cross-border communication, this is when you need to start thinking, how do I need to change the format, change my messaging, change the tone of it, put it on a different channel, what's the scheduling. So yeah, all very important points that we explore with our clients. So next, I want to talk about something a little different that we're seeing, a model, a framework that we're seeing come out of COVID-19 is something we call citizen innovation. It used to be traditional public-private partnerships. The problems are discussed within a very small group. You have few long-term, heavy investment initiatives. You have a very long, arduous bidding process. It's really, the organizations or the companies that want to provide some solution, they submit information to the government. But now what we're really seeing as a new model of productivity between government and citizens is a transparent and engaged approach, where governments have both short and long-term initiatives, projects. The process for application is very clear. A lot of times there's a lot of bi-directional communication through webinars and government sharing information about what problems are we seeing in transportation, what problems are we seeing trying to do contact tracing. And that is actually allowing people to feel empowered, They're not helpless just sitting at home waiting for the next wave of, COVID-19 to come. So, and this really allows government entities and leaders to foster a sense of community, to foster a sense of ecosystem, especially as many countries start to orient more and more towards digital ecosystem, digital economies. So this is one model that we really want to encourage all leaders to think about, is how can I, using the principles of transparency, clear communications, bi-directional communication, community ecosystem building, to enhance productivity in my region. Next, we just have some examples. So, Singapore Mobility Challenge is an initiative I think they've done 2-3 years. And again, it's just a very easy interface for citizens to find out what are the challenges, how can I help, what's the criteria for selection, how do I collaborate, is there mutual learning possible for me as I help government solve problems. Next.
So, Chris is talking really about something important to the APO, which is how to be productive, how to increase productivity. And here, this is what happened in Portugal. It's a tiny country, just 10 million people. But when the crisis hit there, they didn't necessarily have a lot of government money to throw at the problem, but they sort of embraced all the entrepreneurs and all the startups. So within a few weeks, they had 30 different projects, okay, 250 different companies, 5,000 citizens. So one of the keys that Chris, I think, is showing here is that you can open up all this talent that is right there in your country, and often for free. These people were not asking to be paid for, rising up and saving their country from this crisis. And sometimes governments forget how much talent they have, and it's just creating avenues to sort of embrace that. And then you can bring the scale of government in later when you have larger projects. Chris is going to tell you a little more on the same topic now. Next.
Great. Yeah, so part of that framework is, integrating, storytelling into that, sharing your problems, transparency in action, prototyping, experimentation. And then next, we want to talk about reimagining, the world after COVID-19 and scenario planning. So we are really still in the midst of discovering what's next. We know that there are paradigm shifts. There's some trends that are already clear, like, increase of digital, increase of mobile workers, more safety and restriction needed in terms of travel, transportation, but in terms of the shape and the timing for recovery, which, how serious will different sectors be impacted? There are a lot of uncertainties. But, what we find really helpful, and some of the things that we've been doing with leadership training, here from Silicon Valley, is working with organizations to help them map key uncertainties, and then saying, okay, hypothetically, scenario might be from A to C, and then there's a bell curve. What's the extreme scenario, really extreme, like in 10, right? And then what's the extreme on the other end? And then how do we figure out what are the indicators? For example, say visitors, tourists stop coming. Will they come back in 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months? And then, how can I figure out how quickly they will come back? And then helping leaders pinpoint what are the information I need as we start to reopen, so that I can make certain decisions about how quickly we need to be deploying certain technologies, how much investment should we be putting into, airport security, or should I be worried more about, local contact tracing, for example. And then also we're seeing this orientation towards building a digital economy become more urgent than ever. And then so we've been working with organizations and government entities on developing this entrepreneur's toolkit, innovation skills that will allow your organizations to be able to adapt to the current situation and start preparing for the future. And John can speak more to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think is very important is design thinking. And this is a really big term in innovation. I'm a big believer. There have been a number of stories that some of the greatest leaders today, in terms of countries, have been women who have started with empathy and really started with people's needs. And there's, of course, a famous leader in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. And she has done a masterful job, and she's been a straight talker, but she's also guided really what it means to social distance, what it means to look out for the common good. Whereas in many countries, some Western countries, let's say, people have sort of assumed things, and you really can't assume when you're talking about new behavior. I wish our country had done much better with modeling what mask wearing is, modeling, social distancing. In my work, with some of my work with IDEO and writing about innovation, we have archetypes we talk about. And I just want to give you 5 of them that I think are important to have on your team. One is the caretaker. So this is really about thinking of your customer, but of course we call it caretaker. So it's like a nurse or a doctor. So you really care about your citizens or your employees. The anthropologist, and the anthropologist is really the person who is out there looking and seeing what works and what doesn't work. Because with something as fast moving as COVID, you're going to make changes along the way. My favorite role actually is the cross-pollinator. And I think there's so many different things that have worked in different countries and different companies now. The smartest thing you can do is look beyond your region, right, to other places where they've tried something different. And then something we've talked about throughout our talk is prototyping. We call this the experimenter. And you have to take some chances, which can be a little hard for governments to do because you sort of want everything to be perfect. And of course, another type, you're not going to be surprised, the storyteller. So I think it's important to have at least these 5 roles on your major teams. And I think that can really help. Next.
All right, so we do want to, before we wrap up, get you guys thinking about how immediately you can adopt some techniques to help your team or your organization become more action-oriented. And I find that people sometimes, because we communicate on a day-to-day, everyday basis, we sometimes aren't as thoughtful about the way that we communicate, but our words do count. So I find that how and what questions can be very important in increasing kind of that team action-orientedness. So for example, especially when people are working at home remotely, sometimes things get dropped. Maybe there's too much going on at home, a lot can go wrong. And our immediate reaction sometimes as leaders is, why didn't this happen, right? And I think immediately you can already feel that the response is, well, this, reason A, reason B, reason C, that, whatever was meant to be done wasn't done. But if we can move past sort of something that got dropped and say, and look to the future and say, well, okay, we expected, this thing to happen by today, but it didn't happen. How do we make sure that XXX happens by next week? What do we need to do? What can I do, as a leader, or what do you need to, prepare so that we make sure that this gets done? In addition, I think a lot of times, maybe as leaders, we hear like, oh, check in with your team. And a lot of times we might, every day ask our team, well, what are you doing today? Well, then their immediate response is going to be, well, I'm doing 10 things, I'm doing 20 things, right? But that doesn't necessarily help your organization move forward. But if you're really targeting your question and saying, what are you doing today, or what are you focused on this week to make sure, for example, that we have a effective strategy to reopen, this particular sector, you're already training your team's mind on a very specific goal. And this is what comes with powerful, effective communication. It's really about directing the awareness, directing the problem-solving abilities that all of us have onto a target. And as a leader, you get to pick that target and you get to direct people's attention. We can't emphasize enough how important good communication is. And that's why, Panorama, we do a lot of training and discussion about how do you become effective communicators. So on that note, that's about it for our presentation today, but we are excited to address your questions. So please send them in if you have any questions, if anything is unclear.
Well, thank you so much, Chris and Jonathan. I thought within a short span of 20 minutes, you have more or less encapsulated a lot of important points. So allow me to just crystallize some of your thoughts. I think this is all about telling a story and creating a narrative and having a crisis management communications tool for a different kind of war. Now we are fighting crisis that's actually invisible. And this crisis in a postmodern world is something that we need to really be aware of. And you have provided very good case studies to explore the correlation between effective communications and trust management, as well as trust building during crisis. And this is important because once you build up the trust, the economy can be effectively opened up and you can actually sustain productivity gains in the end. And before we go on to the live questions, I would like to just say hi from various viewers who have actually sent their regards to us. And we have from Singapore, from India, from Indonesia, as well as from Mauritius as well. And greetings from several people. And they have several questions as well right now. So without further ado, please allow me to just consolidate some of the questions and I will present them to you right now. So the first question is from a very senior and experienced consultant whom we also know, Mr. Kelvin Chan. So Mr. Kelvin Chan is a productivity expert as well. And his question is, how would you measure productivity in terms of effectiveness and efficiency of digital communications? So in the Asian Productivity organization, we talk about the centrality of productivity. So we would like to see how effective digital communications can actually be quantifiable and correlated back to productivity measurement. Any views on that? Jonathan, perhaps?
Well, we know how fast it is, and we know that you can get out actually a very short communication, and then it can go in multiple channels, which is, I think, something important Chris was talking about earlier. So it's just the speed that you can get message, the speed at which you can make a change in strategy. I actually think things have changed a little bit here in California. We know, I think they've changed a little bit in Tokyo, and the leaders in both places have to make just instant decisions within hours. And I think there's no better and more effective way to do that in the digital mediums.
Yes. And and I would add to that, I think one of the reasons why we think that it's it's important to have, interactive and bidirectional communications, is that especially through many of the digital channels now, that your message, has been received when you start to see engagement. So whether it's people responding and sharing their emotions around a new initiative, that response alone will tell you whether or not people are understanding what you're trying to achieve. People are understanding what you're trying to communicate, and then also just whether it's spreading. So is your messaging spreading? And there's different ways to track that. Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much, Johnson and Chris. A follow-up question, perhaps. A recent Forbes article actually reported that 15 minutes of storytelling could boost employee productivity by up to 23%. So this viewer is asking, does good storytelling really create a material impact on productivity in regards to this Forbes article? So any views on that? Any comments?
Well, today morale is huge, both at companies and with citizens, and it's clear that there can be a bad mood and a bad culture can set in very quickly, which is not productive at all. So, I advocate more than 15 minutes of storytelling would actually increase productivity quite a bit more, because you need people on target and focused around objectives. And you actually have to help. I've studied this a bit with some of my work. These bad habits. We're all starting to have some bad habits because we're working remotely, and it's a new way of working. So the storytelling can be to help us to get over some of the bad habits and move towards some of the good ones.
True. Chris, any comment?
Sure. Yeah. I think, yes, storytelling does create a material impact. How it's helping productivity is that a lot of times when you set a very general theoretical direction, sometimes your team or the organization, they might not know how you want to implement it. So storytelling is a good way of supporting, a initiative or a direction that you set by giving people concrete examples of how a principle that you're recommending be followed. So storytelling is really important in that sense. And then also as we mentioned earlier, it's really, as leaders, I think we want to inspire people towards action as opposed to, give strict rules and have to enforce them. So when you can, tell it in the form of a story and show the logic of your reasoning and why you think a certain principle or rule is important, I think that really helps people then accept that change in direction.
Yeah, I just add quickly, it turns out that the Prime Minister in Ireland just gave a statement not too long ago in these last weeks. And he started with talking about his partner, my sisters and their husbands are working in the healthcare service here in Ireland. They are all apprehensive. This is the calm before the storm, before the surge. And when it comes, and it will come, never will so many ask so much of so few. You may remember those words. Those are paraphrased from Churchill. So here in 5 lines, he's telling a story, bringing his family in and bringing this legendary leader. And that shows how you can create a story with just a paragraph.
Right. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Chris. We have a flurry of other questions coming in. I think this one has great relevance to what you have just brought up with regards to the leader from Ireland. So Thomas Chia has a question. So with regard to COVID-19, which country do you think has done fabulously in crisis management and crisis communications? Anyone?
So I'll just quickly say something, let Chris do most of it. But I'd say all the countries that have women who are leaders, they've all done incredibly well. I don't think there is a country with a woman that has not done well. And we have women who lead in Asia, and we have women who've led in Europe. Obviously, New Zealand, we mentioned. The most famous woman, of course, is Angela Merkel, right? But there's actually in Taiwan, you have a great leader, in Finland. But I'll let Chris continue on.
Yeah, no. I mean, I agree with what you mentioned, John, and it's not so much, I mean, I think not so much which country has done well in crisis management, but I think in the US, I just wanted to point out sort of an interesting example where, the government has not been very, has been very fragmented, to say the least, in terms of its management. But it's interesting because, on the other hand, we've seen a lot of great examples of private enterprise. And we know that, especially in the US, government and business are much more separated. We're seeing a lot of great examples of business leaders, come up with new frameworks. And even though, US as a country may be suffering with crisis management, but a lot of these new models that are coming out and new trends from COVID-19 is coming out still from the West. So I find that to be a really interesting dynamic that's come out recently.
Yeah, and I would say, of course, that there are at least half a dozen, Asian countries who've done incredibly well.
Yeah.
Shockingly well, and I sort of wish I was there right now, to be honest.
Yeah.
I see. Well, thank you so much for your response. Please allow me to get back to another question from Mr. Kelvin Chan in Singapore. And I thought this is actually a very pertinent question for a lot of our APO member countries that has a very diverse population demographics. So in some digital communication, there can be a wide variety and a wide variation of audience. So are there any pointers from the experts to be mindful of to ensure an effective communication to the targeted audience, noting that the targeted audience is extremely diverse and disparate?
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump on this one first. I think the fact is just that in our modern world, there's just a lot of sub-communities and subcultures, and it's hard to just say, any large group of people are consuming information the same way. And from the same type of devices. So, I was just doing a study for one of our corporate clients, on, how focused mobile communication or how much, communications is done on mobile, in Asia, whereas, a lot of the West is still reading emails and doing business by emails. I found that there's some great examples of governments adapting to that. I mean, I know, Singapore government has been, sending updates to citizens through WhatsApp. In SF, so even local leaders, this is not something that only, government leaders or national leaders can do. So in SF, San Francisco, that is, I get text updates of the most important, updates on restrictions or on guidance from San Francisco City. So, I mean, I can't emphasize enough the importance of widening your communication channels and just not expecting all your audience members to, know what website to go to and know to where to get that information. And that's really going to help the effectiveness of your messaging across a large population. Go ahead.
And I'd add, Chris, this goes to prototyping because there's so many different medium. Every year there's a new model. We've moved, we're 10 or 20 years away from the broadcast model, really, of television, of major radio, of major newspapers. And you have to experiment as a government. You have to try different things because you don't know where the engagement will happen in advance with a different story.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the growth of different communication channels in different countries, I think, has been, very organic. I think many of these platforms wish they were number one in every single country, but that's just not the case. And that also goes for if we're using these channels. It's hard for us to predict what is going to be the most engaging platform. But I think just one quick note is authenticity is still very important. So as you're on different platforms, you might experiment with different tone as you're trying to reach different demographics, different age groups. But being authentic and knowing what's the core of your message, and keeping that consistent so there's no confusion. I think those are all key principles.
Thank you so much for your sharing. I have another viewer who actually has given us a question to our experts separately. And the question reads, for governments and businesses, who should be on a crisis communication team respectively? I think this bears great relevance to a lot of member countries' governments as they deal with building trust back again during this COVID-19 crisis. So, Jonathan and Chris, I pass the floor to you.
I'll just say a couple of quick things and let Chris take most of it. But you really need writers and editors, and then you need very technical people who really know these different medium. Whether here in the U.S. it would be LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and so forth. It's going to be completely different in Vietnam, and it might be different in Thailand as well. But you need someone who can write quickly, and you need an editing team to approve things, and then you need this technical team.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, in terms of, especially during a crisis, you need someone who's very strong on the operational and very good with the detail, the practical implementations, because they will help you think about, what are the challenges for implementing this and that initiatives. And the other person I think is really key to include, and this is, many times it could be different people, is someone who can help this reimagination, can help this sort of sometimes people say futurist, this visionary character, because especially in a crisis, you need someone who's thinking, well, where could we go from here? And that's not necessarily the same person as the people who are great at the everyday ground operations, figuring out the details, and they fight the visionary, the futurist, saying, hey, we need to do a 180 but those are two really essential roles to have on your crisis team.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much, Jonathan. So we still do have a few more questions. Please feel free, viewers, if you have any further questions, feel free to put your comments and your questions in the comment section, or you can put it in the live chat session, and we will take it offline with our experts if we don't have enough time to answer your questions. So perhaps for one last question before we call it a day, I have a question from Mr. Bernard Ng. So Bernard says, a good thing about digital communication is actually the recording part. So any recommended good practices, like when to or when not to do recording? I think this is quite interesting, and I would like to hear the views of both Jonathan and Chris.
You want to give it a start, Chris?
Sure. So I think whether or not to record, I think it's really, it's good for, note keeping or going back and referring to it. I think the question is more that, or not the question, but the sort of the issue, especially I guess, sort of putting my legal corporate law hat on as opposed to my growth hat, is, the issue is when you say something and you're not expecting it to be recorded, but there's just so many ways, right? Whether it's, a screen shot or someone, just so many, like you said, now there's that capability. So I think what the implication of that, or what it's caused, is that then a lot of times leaders will say, well, I don't know, what if I just say one little thing and someone records it and that turns into something else? So why don't I let my spokesperson, as a CEO, maybe I let the HR person do all the talking, as a, organizational leader, I'll let the PR person do all the talking. And that really disconnects, you from the people that you're leading. And just sort of in the example of Airbnb CEO coming out and saying, we've been building this for 12 years and we almost lost all of it in 6 weeks. I mean, that's a really scary thing to say, but I think, as a even just, you're not an Airbnb employee, there's sort of a respect that you pay to a leader who can say that, right? So so I think when or when not to record is not so much an issue, but thinking ahead about what you really want to communicate, and still, not being shy about putting your face out there and communicating.
Yeah, and I'd add, Chris, I think to really be a great leader, you have to take some risks. You do want to talk to your lawyers, and you want to be smart, but you've got to take some risks, and you can't hide behind, public relations or, other lieutenants. Some of these great leaders, many of them women, are getting out there and saying pretty bold things, and it works.
Right. Well, thank you so much. In fact, just now you brought in 2 very interesting points. The first point was about Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky. So Brian Chesky actually is quite a good example of effective digital communications. So of course, there are some sound bites and quote-worthy quotations, but more importantly, when he fired off 25% of his global workforce, 25% of his global workforce, he actually made every single laid-off employee feel like $1 million because of his very effective digital communication strategies. So thanks, Chris, for bringing out the case of Brian Chesky. And perhaps we have reached the end of the APO productivity talk, but I would like to take this opportunity, like what Jonathan Littman and Chris have shared with us. During a crisis, leaders' communication skills are actually put under a magnifying glass. So people not only will have to know how effectively leaders communicate, but also how proactively they do so. So I would like to pass, say, 1 minute or 2 minutes to both Chris and Jonathan, respectively, to conclude and to give us some final remarks and final words. Jonathan and Chris.
So just quickly, I think if you're trying to build this capability in your government or your country, I think you've got to define each crisis. And you've got to define it in a sort of cogent way with facts, with data, that can be very persuasive. But I think, as Chris has said quite well tonight, you need a story. You need sort of a heroic path. People are not convinced only by facts. And so that's where you have to be smart and creative and coming up with a story. And I think one of the things we've seen in this crisis is that leaders don't sort of lecture or order, they lead and they inspire and they get people who really want to. There was a really inspiring quote I saw earlier today in Vietnam where, a lot of people in Vietnam were saying, well, this wasn't just our country. This was us. We came to this challenge. And I think that speaks to true leadership when you get that sort of citizen involvement.
Right.
Yes. So to summarize some of the points that we've discussed today, I would say it's very important to both engage with your citizens or your organization, both on, as John was saying, on the intellectual sense and also on the emotional sense. And then another sort of interesting dynamic is people want to figure out solutions. So providing sometimes when there is a lot of uncertainty, at least setting a direction. And then apart from setting direction, the implementation is important. The details is very important, but that vision and what will happen in the future, that's something I think, Silicon Valley is very well known for, because it really is about orienting a large group of people to put all their resources into solving a big problem. So like what Josh was saying, we're fighting, this pandemic war. And to do that, communication, what is its role? It's coordination. It's making sure that the right people are in the right place, that you're engaging all the problem solving, all the resources that you can. And that's what, productivity comes from, is when you have, that coherence in a large group of people. So yeah, so hopefully today we provided some interesting examples that you can look at, explore further. We're happy to engage further offline if that would be helpful, through the APO. And then also, hopefully some of these techniques were helpful in terms of targeting your questions, targeting your check-ins with your, team, using what and why statements, thinking about uncertainties, which there's plenty of, today. And hopefully this has been helpful.
Yeah, and I might just add one thing is we would love to learn from you. I mean,
Yes.
there are a lot of smart people in the audience tonight, and we'd love to hear, what's working for you and
Right.
some strategies that are working in your countries. It's been an honor to be a part of this tonight, and we wish you well.
Yes. Yes, and to second that.
Honor as well. Yeah, to invite you. So today, perhaps the leading message of our productivity talk is that leaders need to master multiple digital channels and build up robust two-way communication channels, like what Jonathan suggested. You want to learn as much as the viewers want to learn from you. So compelling communications through both digital and traditional channels will increase the ability to guide countries, businesses, and communities to actually thrive, as well as to sustain productivity gains. So the APO will host more productivity talks featuring leading resource person and leading speakers, just like Jonathan and Chris, and throughout the remaining of this year, as well as in the next year and beyond. So please join our series of APO productivity talks featuring world-leading experts and guest speakers who will look at topics like business continuity, economic resilience, and which addresses socio-economic prosperity, inclusiveness, and productivity in the APO region. So until then, Jonathan, as well as Chris, I wish you stay safe and keep healthy during this COVID-19 lockdown. So stay safe, Chris, and stay safe, Jonathan.
Thank
you.
And
viewers, thanks, Josh.
See you at the next productivity talk.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Bye.